I will stop my screen share and we will pass it off to Sam.
Great. Hi, thanks for the introduction and good to get to know your organization a little bit. So yeah, I'm Sam and I'm sitting in the Caterpillar lab here. So I want to explain that for a minute and also just give you a bit of an outline for the talk to come. So the Caterpillar lab, it's a physical location in southern New Hampshire. And basically the space I'm in is where we rear thousands and thousands and thousands of native caterpillars every year. Last year, I think we reared over 600 different native species. These are all caterpillars that you could find around your houses on the way to school, whether you're down here in New Hampshire or way up there in Maine. We take the caterpillars around to nature centers, museums, schools, and we tell their stories. We look at them, we appreciate their sort of character, their defenses, their life cycles, and especially their role in the ecological world. So we're often showing how they're interacting with plants and other species. This whole project started with photography. I just took pictures of caterpillars and would show those pictures in galleries. Very quickly, though, I started bringing in live caterpillars to gallery openings, and that really turned into the first live caterpillar shows, and all of this grew from there. I think the website's a bit out of date at this point. 7 years was maybe quite a while ago at this point. I started taking photos in 2009 of caterpillars, but I started rearing them as a 4-year-old, so I have been at this for a while. I often give talks, especially in the wintertime, that are organized around a PowerPoint, slideshows, videos, and a sort of central narrative. But I felt since we're really in caterpillar season, and since we had so many different species of caterpillar in the lab already, that I would just come here by my actual live microscope with a whole bunch of caterpillars and a whole bunch of potential stories and do some show and tell and get into their stories and see where that takes us. I do want to start by just celebrating caterpillar diversity, giving you all a sense for how many ways there is to be a caterpillar. So it's not just a simple thing. It's not just the tobacco hornworms on the tomato plants, the woolly bears, or the brown tail moths. There are a lot of different ways to be a caterpillar. I thought we would try to look at how caterpillars grow and change. I've got some great examples of caterpillars in between stages. And then I wanted to talk about some really wonderful sort of, I guess I'd call them a case study, ecological case studies, looking at some of my favorite stories, caterpillars that do very strange things and interact in very strange ways in nature. Since I have so much around me, all these caterpillars at my feet, I'm also very happy to take questions. I think as we go, questions that relate as best possible to what we're talking about at the time. And then at the end of the exploration together, we can take questions and just have a discussion that's a little bit more freewheeling. I do want to acknowledge you're all, well, many of you are from the coast of Maine, and the coast of Maine has been having some trouble with an invasive species called the brown tail moth. I am planning to address that and show you some of its relatives and talk about what's been going on there. But for the beginning, let's just look at some native caterpillars and have some fun. All right, so again, feel free to type in questions as we go. So I'm starting with something on the microscope. So here's my microscope camera here. I can pass my hand underneath and it's going to come across on the screen, although nobody really wants to see my hand. I've actually been looking for stem boring caterpillars all day in a marsh, so my hands are pretty well mucked up. But under the microscope right now, there's a little box very similar to this one. So it's a tiny little box with a couple of leaves stretched right across the top of it. And on those leaves, you could probably just make out a few little spots. So I'm starting with some of the smallest caterpillars. There's a caterpillar on the screen right now. Maybe you can see it moving just a little bit. That's not on a leaf, and it's not under a leaf, but it's inside of a leaf. And we use these leaf mining caterpillars a lot at programs to help adjust people's sense of scale and to help challenge the notion of what a caterpillar can be. Again, not every caterpillar is the hornworm or the woolly bear or the one moving around on the outside of the plants eating leaves. Many, many species are tiny little things that are living inside of leaves or stems. And this one is a really neat one, just came from right outside my house. I'm going to change the light a bit so we can get a better view. It's a leaf miner in a chenopodium plant or a pigweed. And this is the caterpillar here. This is where it's been eating. So that's a hollowed out leaf. This is its frass or its poop. They poop where they live too. And if we zoom in a bit, we'll just get a sense for how small this little critter is. Hold on a bit. All right, so for those of you who know what a cell is, let me try and get the focus a bit better. These little grain-like textures, these are the cells of the leaf. So this caterpillar is so small that it's just eating a few little cells at a time. And it's one of many species that use this host plant, the chenopodium or the pigweed. And it's one of thousands of species of leaf miners. There are so many leaf miners that we certainly don't know all the species that live here in New England. New ones are being found all the time. And it's one of the easiest group of caterpillars to just go out and find. So if you just really are in need of a caterpillar, you go out in summer, even into fall, and you look for any little squiggles, blotches, lines on a leaf. Every tree seems to have its own cohort of leaf mining caterpillars. And you just hold up that leaf to the sun, to the sky, and you'll see them in there. Rearing them is a bit more of a challenge. We put them in little containers. We make sure the leaf stays happy and moist. And oftentimes we get a moth popping out. Actually, more often than that, we get something else popping out, which I'm going to talk about later today. We often get a wasp because these leaf miners, their #1 predator is parasitoid wasps. So stay tuned for more of that. So we started with the smallest here, and we're going to look at some other peculiar caterpillars before we get to the sort of standards, but these are leaf mining caterpillars. We had a school program based on these, and the kids were so excited about the leaf miners that they all went outside during recess and found a whole bunch, and we weren't really expecting this. So we get an email from the teacher who now has a bucket of leaf mining caterpillars and no idea what to do with them, and we were trying to help them rear them. So it's not always a good idea to take them off the plant because it's hard to get them to grow up. But the sheer number of leaf miners out there is astounding. This is something else altogether. We've got a fern ball here. So this is made from a fern leaf, but it's been wrapped up in a very peculiar way into this perfect little ball. This is a caterpillar that doesn't live inside of a leaf, but it makes a home out of a leaf. This is a fern ball leaf roller, Herpetogramma. And we work with these a lot because the caterpillars that make these, they're sheltered from the eyes of birds and other predators. They don't have to be camouflaged. They don't really have to look any particular way. So they end up being pretty transparent. And I've opened up one of these leaf balls so that we can see the caterpillar. And it's a good sort of place to start with getting a look at what makes a caterpillar here. So here's a fern leaf roller. Everyone can see this, okay? So it's opened up. It's already been putting silk back down. It's trying to close up its little home here. There we go. Got turned around. Here's its face looking up at us. It's got some silk around. Yeah, a little surprising. I think it's sort of looking at the camera here. There we go. And because it's that leaf roller, because it's sheltered from where birds' eyes are looking, again, it's transparent and we can see things like a caterpillar heart beating right down the back. So wait and see if you can see that pulsing. So over the years of doing these programs, we've learned a lot of tricks, a lot of ways to sort of get people a little closer to these creatures, to give them a look that's pretty rare, pretty uncommon for us to see. And the leaf rollers have offered the best look at the internal organs of a caterpillar. So we watch the heartbeat using the microscopes. We can even see things like the breathing tubes that caterpillars have. So caterpillars have the long heart down the back. There it goes. You might see that again in some other caterpillars I put under the microscope. And they have little breathing holes in the side. I don't know if you can make out the white branching tubes going into the caterpillar here from the holes in the side. Those are bringing air into the animal. So every caterpillar species, whether it's a leaf miner that helps us talk about scale and explore the smaller creatures in the universe, or whether it's a leaf roller that lets us sort of look into the inside of a caterpillar, every species that we've encountered has its strength, has its sort of interesting points, and lets us explore incredible topics with people. And so many of them are just so common. This leaf roller is something that many of you will have very close to your house. It's just a question of time of year, finding it and knowing that we can see these things under the microscope. I'm going to check in on one other leaf roller that I opened up just to see if we've got another kind of view, see some other internal bits. Looks like it's done a pretty good job though at putting the silk down. Give it one shot here. I'll try not to fiddle and fuddle too much with the microscope during the presentation, but I want to get you the best views possible. All right, so here's the other leaf roller. This one's a little younger and a little clearer. And if we zoom in really far, there we go. There are those incredible branching tracheal tubes, the breathing tubes that come in from the outside of the caterpillar. We've looked at so many of these now. We've had all the surprises. We've been able to spot different caterpillar organs and different leaf rollers. And sometimes we've even seen other insects living inside the caterpillar we're looking at. I sort of mentioned the parasitic wasps that could use the first leaf miners as a host, that we'd get a wasp sometimes when we're raising those caterpillars. Well, we've been looking at these transparent caterpillars and had a wasp larva swim by inside the caterpillar. I will explain all that a little better later. I can't resist talking about it whenever I think, oh, there could be a wasp in there. I have to explain. All right, so let's move on to talking about sort of more classic caterpillars. So we had leaf miners and leaf rollers, but many of you will think of a caterpillar as sort of a long cylinder with colors and spines, different characters, a head capsule at one end, something that lives externally on the plants around you that you might see. So this is the largest of New England's caterpillars. This is the Cecropia giant silk moth. It's really a wonderful species. It's got all kinds of different colors. It's large, so we can really see in detail all of its different parts. This is the head over here, sort of questing around. Come on, buddy. There we go. We've got these incredibly colorful tubercles all over the back. It's a spine, sort of a hardened round spine that the Cecropia caterpillars have. The breathing holes in the side, these are the gated holes that go into those tracheal tubes, the breathing tubes we were looking at. Let's try to get all the way to the end of the caterpillar here. And the prolegs on the underside, which are why I'm sort of fumbling this caterpillar a bit, because these legs keep sticking to my fingers. So it's getting a little bit in the way of a good microscope look. So caterpillars have these, well, many caterpillars have prolegs along the body. They're squishy, they're soft, they've got these little grippy Velcro pads on them. They grab onto their host plant really well.
I'm doing a caterpillar lab.
Oh, Jesus.
But look at the
I
caterpillar.
sent a message to Sean.
All right, so we're seeing the legs here. And if I move
everyone
up to
could
the
just
top,
mute their video, that would be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
here we go. So caterpillars have two different kinds of legs. We've got the 6 true legs in the front that all caterpillars have, and we've got fleshy prolegs in the back that most caterpillars have, though there's some exceptions we'll see pretty soon. The fleshy prolegs are lost as the caterpillar grows up and becomes an adult, and we're going to look at that. But the true legs stay with it. And we're going to get one look at our Cecropia head capsule here before I move on to yet another caterpillar. Another thing that's standard for all caterpillars, you can see there's 5 eyes on each side of the head. All caterpillars have 5 eyes on each side of the head. There are other things that look like caterpillars that can be distinguished because they don't. The sawfly larva, for instance, only has 1 eye or ocelli on each side of the head. Caterpillars also have these chewing mouth parts. A very important part of a caterpillar right here, and something we'll talk a bit about are these mandibles. Really strong cutting mouth parts that let them eat a lot of leaves. All right, so that's the Cecropia caterpillar. This is one I've been raising again since I was a very little kid. Big caterpillar, charismatic, turns into North America's largest flying insect. It's got a 6 to 7 inch wingspan. So for many of you out there, that means if it was sitting on your nose, the wings would cover your whole face. It's a creature that gets a lot of people into insects and into nature, a surprise. We find surprises are great for education, great for sparking interest. And if you were just walking down the street, going by a street light, and there was a Cecropia moth sitting there, it looks like something most people would expect to see in the tropics, in Australia or the Amazon, but it's a native creature. Makes it all the way up through Maine and is replaced as you go very far north with a northern counterpart called the Columbia silk moth. The ones that are way up the coast in Maine, the Columbia silk moths mostly eat larch. Down here, though, the Cecropia eats cherry, eats ash, walnut, buttonbush, all kinds of different plants that we find in our forests. It's not the only big caterpillar that lives around here. We've got quite a few giant silk moths. These are the polyphemus giant silk moths, not quite as big as a Cecropia, but equally charming. We've got the breathing holes on the side. We've got these incredible sort of metallic shining spots at the base of the hair. We don't really know exactly what those are doing for this caterpillar. Maybe just making it look like the caterpillar is a leaf with little bits of dew on it rather than just a big easy to eat meal. Maybe breaking up the body outline of this caterpillar so a bird would be confused as to what it's looking at. This species eats tougher plants than the Cecropia, so its head capsule is bigger and its mandibles are stronger. So this caterpillar is meant to eat late season oaks, and it needs all the tools to be able to do that. So we've sort of hit upon two main themes about caterpillars just in the few we've looked at, and there's many, many more. So I'll have to pick and choose because I could spend like 4 hours showing you caterpillars. The two main themes are we've got caterpillars that are on plants and they're eating leaves. That's a huge deal for a caterpillar. Caterpillar's #1 job in life is just to eat leaves, turn that into caterpillar body, grow up nice and strong, and move on in life. So they're really the growing stage of life for these organisms. They don't need to worry about the adult stage because they're going to grow up to be butterflies and moths. That's really the definition of a caterpillar. It's the young or the larva of butterflies and moths. But as a larva, as a juvenile, they don't need to worry about being attractive. They don't need to worry about defending territory. They just need to worry about eating and growing as the sort of #1 thing. And aside from that, staying alive, staying safe so that they can eat and grow. So the polyphemus here has got the eating and growing down really well. The big mouth, the mandibles, the legs to hold on to its plant, a long body with a long digestive tract. Eating, pooping, growing. As far as defending itself, maybe it's a little bit harder to understand exactly what a polyphemus caterpillar is doing to defend itself. It's got spines, hairs, different colored baubles. Is it trying to say that maybe it's toxic with the bright colors, or is it trying to blend in with all that green? I know that when I find them in the wild and I give them a little poke on a leaf, they gnash their mandibles at me, making a clicking sound. And if I give them another little poke, they throw up all over my finger. So they're pretty good at defending themselves. Maybe they're just trying to be threatening, and that stomach acid they throw up probably doesn't taste so good. But when we look at each caterpillar, whether it's a leaf miner or whether it's a big one like this, we're going to be looking at a creature that's just a combination of eating and growing and defending itself. The mouth, the digestive tract, the legs to hang on, the mandibles to eat, and all the bells and whistles, all the colors and patterns, all of that. It's all about staying alive and safe from birds, from wasps, from all the things that want to eat them. So with that, let me show you some other pretty strange caterpillars. Sorry about the motorcycles outside.
Sam, could I interject with a quick question?
Absolutely.
When and where can someone see a Cecropia moth?
That's a good question. Pretty much right now, the adult moths of the giant silk moths, the Luna, the Polyphemus, the Cecropia, they are flying currently. So at my moth light, I put out a sheet with a mercury vapor light. I have those moths flying in right now in the evening time. The caterpillars that I'm showing you, those are ahead of schedule. We've been rearing them indoors in the lab so that we can have big, fun caterpillars to talk about at programs. So the life cycle of the Cecropia or the Polyphemus is we're having the moths flying right now. They'll be mating and laying eggs very soon. The eggs hatch and we get the caterpillars in the late spring and summer. And then they spend the winter as a pupa in a cocoon. So we'll look at all of that, but now's a great time to go out and look underneath parking lot lights. You can go early in the morning to see what moths may have flown in, and you might get to see your first Cecropia. So we're going to go for a more subtle caterpillar. We looked at sort of these big ones with some color. Maybe they're just too big for most birds to eat. Maybe they're toxic. We don't really know exactly how they're defending themselves, but a lot of caterpillars can't get away with just sitting out there in the open. Many have to be camouflaged. So there's a caterpillar that's coming into view here, and it's one of the twig mimics. So this is a Euclena caterpillar. It's an inchworm or a twig geometer, and it's blending in. It's looking just like a blueberry twig. We've got a couple others in this box. We can try and find them. The microscope certainly helps. There's one going sort of along the twig. And oddly enough, there's one that's sort of sticking off the side of the container up here. Not as hard to understand because it's, you know, what's a twig doing sticking off the side of the container. So these caterpillars and many like them are camouflaging. So they've got their mouth, they've got their digestive tract, they've got their favorite plants to eat, but everything that makes them different from all the other caterpillars is how they're choosing to defend themselves. So these are twig mimics. They're defending themselves by staying hidden. They don't want birds or anything else to see them. Their life during the day is just subtle and still, and it's only at night that they start to move around and look for food. You can also see there's a little line of silk here. I hope you can make that out. These twig mimics during the day, they have a lifeline of silk so that if a spider comes crawling along here or some other predator and tries to grab it, the caterpillar can release and dangle in midair. You may have actually seen caterpillars hanging from threads. That can be for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is if a predator came by and they needed to escape from that predator. There's a lot of twig mimics. That one that I just showed you overwinters as a caterpillar. So that was out there all winter long, freezing and thawing on the plants. It's a major food source for the birds that can find them. Golden crowned kinglets depend very heavily on these overwintering twig mimic geometer caterpillars. There's some similar ones. This is a caterpillar that also sort of resembles a twig or a dead leaf, but this caterpillar defends itself in other ways too. So it's trying to blend in, it's trying to be camouflaged, but it actually has inflatable tentacles on its back. This is the filament bearer. It's a wonderful species that's had a few moments online where videos of them have gone viral. When they walk, these tentacles flail out sort of like a spider's legs trying to attack you. The video that I was referring to, something it didn't like, it just sort of popped the hairs out a little bit, was taken in the Amazon of one of these walking along, and the comments on the video, the reason it went viral is just because it's such a spectacularly weird creature. The comments were all about how could these things exist, you know, looking at the diversity of the rainforest, marveling at all these weird creatures that live far away from us. And I'm watching the video and knowing that things like the Nematocampa or the filament bearer inchworm here are actually backyard creatures. So it sort of showed me that we tend to expect weird things and expect charismatic creatures, inspiring creatures to live far away, but we don't really expect them to live right next door. And this one certainly does. This one spends the winter as an egg, hatches in the early spring, starts to feed, and quickly, very quickly gets to this size. This is full grown. It's only about 1 centimeter long, but it doesn't have much longer as a caterpillar. I have a whole bunch of other boxes. I just want to check in for a general sort of thumbs up or thumbs sideways or thumbs down, and any questions that might have sort of gotten here. Is there anything that's coming in or any comments, direction you'd like to give?
Yes, so let's see, we had one, let's see, are any of the caterpillars poisonous? And I'm not sure if that's poisonous to us or to other things, if you could touch on that.
Sure, that's sort of a good lead in to just all of the other caterpillars I have in front of me. Caterpillars are often poisonous. More caterpillars than not might actually be poisonous. Caterpillars are eating leaves. They've been eating leaves for many, many thousands of years. And those leaves have evolved defenses against their herbivory. So ways to stay safe from the things that want to eat them. And that means those leaves have been getting all kinds of chemicals, all kinds of nasty toxins in them. And for a while, that keeps many caterpillars from eating those toxic leaves. But caterpillars really want them. It's still a resource to be used. So caterpillars in turn have evolved ways to eat those toxic leaves. And when they start to eat the toxic leaves and digest them, many species start to incorporate or bring in those toxins into their own bodies. So caterpillars get to use as a defense the toxic chemicals that the plants originally evolved to thwart them being eaten. So this caterpillar here might be familiar. It's one of my all-time favorite caterpillars. It's one I've seen for my entire life, often very common. It's the Eastern tent caterpillar. It's a native caterpillar to New England. It's a good species, ecologically speaking, even if sometimes it eats too much of your favorite cherry plant. And it's extremely well chemically defended. It's quite poisonous. It eats only cherry and apple, and those plants have all the ingredients of hydrogen cyanide, a poison, in their leaves. And these caterpillars incorporate or put that hydrogen cyanide into their bodies. So this is a brightly colored caterpillar, blue and gold, bright, bold, white stripe. They live in a big group. They're very obvious. They don't mind being seen by birds because they are protected from birds. There are a few species of birds which have learned how to eat them, just like the caterpillar evolved and learned how to eat the toxic plant. A bird called the yellow-billed cuckoo has evolved and learned how to eat this caterpillar, even though it's full of hydrogen cyanide. So many poisonous caterpillars because there's many poisonous plants that they eat. That said, poison means you wouldn't want to eat the caterpillar. So when I'm saying there's many poisonous caterpillars, don't worry, this one even I can touch and I'm not going to get stung or anything like that. I just wouldn't want to pop a bunch of these in my mouth, which isn't something I often think about. Now, venomous caterpillars exist. There's quite a few of those around. That means there's a caterpillar that you wouldn't want to touch. So like all caterpillars, they're eating, they're growing, they're trying to get to a point when they can move on in their life cycle. But their defensive strategy, rather than hiding, rather than incorporating toxins, is to be able to sting. And one group is just phenomenal that does that. This is a slug caterpillar. So believe it or not, this is a native creature. This thing is pretty common in the New England forests, often eating smooth-leaved plants. This is called the spiny oak slug caterpillar. Now, if it was a slug, it would just stay a slug forever. Slugs don't really grow up and become anything else, but a slug caterpillar is the juvenile of a moth, a slug moth. So this is a caterpillar. It doesn't actually have any prolegs underneath. So those are those sticky legs we looked at on the Cecropia. It does have some true legs and a head over here. It's eating right now, but it's covered with venomous spines. So we've got the bright colors as warning, and we've got these spines which are brittle and they break when they're touched. And each spine has a little bit of venom that they inject. So it feels like a very light bee sting in this case. Now, the nice thing about venomous caterpillars is they're not flying around. They're not chasing after us. These are just subtle creatures on the trees. So knowing about, what caterpillars could potentially cause problems for us, it's sort of down to our own personal responsibility. We can educate ourselves that colorful and spiny or colorful and hairy caterpillars probably aren't the best to be playing with, and that way we can stay safe. This one, again, not something really to worry about. Colorful, cool, but not something I tend to think of as having a very severe sting. Just a note, you can see the heart beating down the back as we're sitting here, that pulsing. I'm sure somebody's noticed that and wondered. Now, there is a caterpillar that makes it up at least through Massachusetts, but may be along the coast, that has a more severe sting. This is the saddleback slug caterpillar. I think one of the more adorable caterpillars, but it also has one of the more potent stings. This one would really hurt if you got stung. Often it's rated higher than many wasp stings. I'm just pretty impressed that these little creatures, even though they're showing up big on the screen here, could humble an adult human being. I do have a strange memory growing up in Eastern Massachusetts of finding one of these and not knowing what it was and having it on my hand and never actually getting stung. I don't know how I got away with that. But here's our little box of our saddleback caterpillars. Sorry, the lighting's not better for this, but so slug caterpillars are pretty diverse. Many of them sting, and there's other caterpillars that sting, like the flannels, the Ios, and there's a whole bunch of itchy caterpillars, which we can talk about when we talk about the brown tail moths. Any other questions before I continue on with some more show and tell?
All right, let's see. Do any of the caterpillars that you've shown cause tree or plant demise?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I think given those questions, maybe it is time to explore towards those brown tail moths and other topics. So Do they cause tree or plant demise? Well, all caterpillars are eating plants. Well, that's not true, but all the caterpillars we've looked at so far are eating plants. There are caterpillars that eat mushrooms, eat dead leaves, eat wood, eat other caterpillars, aphids, they're predatory caterpillars. But a lot eat plants, and for the plant, being eaten by a caterpillar is never a good thing in that moment. So for any individual plant being gnawed on, that's not what the plant wants. Now, when we're talking about native caterpillars and native plants that are in balance, so these are creatures that evolved here, that have been in New England for thousands and thousands of years, eating plants that have been in New England for thousands of years in a natural environment. The caterpillars eating the leaves, even to the point of defoliating a cherry tree like these eastern tent caterpillars can do, is generally a good thing for the ecological world. These caterpillars, the native ones, when they take from a plant, when they're eating those leaves, they give back in a lot of other ways. So the caterpillar eats the leaf, and in essence, what's happening there is the caterpillar is helping move energy around the environment. So this eastern tent caterpillar eats a hard to eat thing. It eats a cherry leaf. You can't go out and eat cherry leaves and make anything from them. Squirrels can't eat cherry leaves. Birds can't eat cherry leaves, but this caterpillar can, and it turns it into caterpillar body, caterpillar meat, eventually a moth body. And those things are a lot easier to eat for a lot of organisms. So caterpillars eating leaves is an indispensable ecological service. We talk about that in terms of pollinators and predators, but we forget how key it is that caterpillars are eating leaves. They're the #1 herbivore in our forest. It's not a subtle thing. They're eating more leaves than all the other herbivores in New England forests combined. Caterpillars are eating a ton of green stuff. And to my eye, when we're talking again about native caterpillars, all that feeding just represents a release and movement of energy that needs to move around in the environment. Caterpillars are doing an ecological service. Now, caterpillars like the eastern tent caterpillar are what we call native defoliators. They, every 10 years or so, can escape the bounds of their predators and parasitoids, and they can become really common and defoliate a lot of trees. But so many things eat these. They have so many predators and parasitoid wasps and flies that after a few years of them being very common, their numbers will go back down. Their numbers will crash because a lot of native species are using them. So an occasional defoliation tends not to damage or kill whole forests. What's happened is that people have changed the world. Sometimes that means we've built a city, we've changed habitats, we've removed or added a plant, or we've caused climate to change. And that can change even how native caterpillars interact. It could make it so a native caterpillar eating a tree isn't as good as it used to be because maybe that tree is suffering or rare or having a hard time for another reason. We also have introduced a lot of species that did not evolve here in New England, that aren't native, that aren't from here. And this is one that's very common down here around me. You've got it up there too. This is the spongy moth, Lymantria dispar. And I'll say, at least for this year, this used to be called the gypsy moth, but there's a movement to change the name. The official new name is the spongy moth. And it is a caterpillar that evolved from in Europe. It's native to Europe. That's where it evolved. That's where its native host plants are. That's where it's in balance and has all kinds of predators. So in Europe, this caterpillar eats a lot and they can defoliate, but things eat them. Things help continue to move the energy around. In North America, where it escaped by accident and sort of took off, there wasn't anything to eat it. So this caterpillar could take and take and take, eat and eat and eat every year, defoliating forests, but nothing was using it. So this is what we call an invasive species. The spongy moth can cause damage to individual trees. It can also defoliate so many years in a row, unchecked, that it can cause forest declines. So I celebrate an eastern tent caterpillar or a forest tent caterpillar devouring a lot of leaves. that to me is a very good thing to see. I do not celebrate a spongy moth on the 4th year in a row defoliating oaks to the points where the oaks are dying. And if you're on the coast of Maine right now, you're experiencing something similar with a very close cousin of this caterpillar called the brown-tailed moth. And the brown-tailed moth is in the same group, the Lymantria tussox, and it's really quite specific to where you are. It's an invasive species, non-native from Europe, that's thriving right now along the coast of Maine. And it's been in this country for a long time now, over 100 years. But for some reason, with a combination of weather and maybe some other factors, the brown-tailed moths started to get out of control on the coast of Maine, and really reproduce like crazy and eat a whole lot of apple and oak and cause some tree death. So what's important to me when thinking about caterpillars eating leaves, or talking about caterpillars as pests or beneficials, is to always just check our reference point. So if it's nature we're concerned about, the ecological world, the health of our forests, our birds, our trees, then native caterpillars eating those is generally a good thing. If it's a plot of pines that we're growing for timber and we want this unnatural plot of pines to thrive, all of a sudden the native caterpillars that eat it, maybe they're not good for our effort to get those pines for timber. Still probably good for the ecological world, but not so good for timber. If we've got tobacco hornworms eating, let's see, some nightshades on the coast, that's a great caterpillar to have around. Native, does a lot for the environment, an important pollinator later on. We should celebrate it as a native creature as part of our ecological world. But if we're talking about whether we get to have tomatoes in our backyards and we really want a good crop of tomatoes, a lot of people will look at those hornworms and say, well, they're not good. They're eating my tomatoes. So with these guys, with the spongy moths, the brown-tail moths, and other invasive species like the winter moths, I think it's a pretty simple equation. These are wonderful creatures where they evolved. They are in balance in Europe, and we could celebrate them there. But because they were introduced here, because they're non-native, and because not enough things ate them, they've gotten out of control and they can cause ecological damage. So these could be considered a pests of our forests, whereas something like the eastern tent caterpillar or the tobacco hornworm, we would never want to think of them as a pest of our forest, but just maybe something that acts against our own human interests sometimes, as far as growing a tomato plant or for the tent caterpillar an orchard. All right, so that's one of my long-winded answers, but I got to show you some other cool caterpillars. Before leaving the topic of the brown-tailed moth, I want to introduce just one complicated thing. Let me just get all my spongy moths away here.
Sam,
There
can I
are
make a
native.
question?
Sure.
Quick question. Can native predators eventually learn to eat introduced caterpillars?
Yes or no. Usually that happens pretty quickly. So we'll see that certain birds, certain parasitoid wasps do use an introduced species right away. That's usually because they've experienced something similar. So that would be like the parasitoid wasps that use the daisy tussocs like these. This is a native species. So even hard to make out as a caterpillar here. It looks like a bunch of fireworks going off. Since these are closely related to the spongy moth, and the brown-tailed moth, you could imagine that a native predator of this might actually use those as well. But I don't believe it's that common that we see over the course of like 10, 20, 100, 200 years, things sort of learning to use it in that kind of time frame. It's really right when those species arrive, there may be things that take advantage of them. But we as human beings have tried to mediate the effects of things like the spongy moth and the brown-tailed moth by introducing parasitoids and predators from where the spongy moth and the brown-tailed moth originated. So from Europe, humans, we introduced a lot of parasitoid wasps, a parasitoid fly, and some pathogens that were meant to help wipe out the species that was out of control. So that's called biological control, biocontrol. 100 years ago, it was done pretty carelessly. Things like a pathogen or a parasitic fly were introduced without a lot of thought, and they attacked our native species and caused their own kinds of problems. You could think of them as invasive species. Now there's a lot more testing, and we hope that what we release to, get rid of a brown-tailed moth isn't also going to cause the decline of something else. But that's where this caterpillar comes in. This is a beautiful thing. These are called the daisy tussocs again. They're very hairy caterpillars, and they're related to the spongy moth and the brown-tailed moth. And we had maybe half a dozen species in New England, and many of them have become rare in recent years. And we don't, this isn't sort of research science here, but there's a general idea that in years where we have the spongy moth and brown-tailed moth outbreaks, our native tussocks decline. So we think that the things that were introduced to kill off the brown-tailed moths and spongy moths have actually gone after our native caterpillars as well. So there's always a balance. We do one thing to try and bring down the numbers of an invasive. Are we hurting the native species? It's a really hard game to play, and humans aren't really equipped to play it. The ecological world is very, very complex, and it's easy to make mistakes, easy to have unintended consequences. Yet at the same time, we can't just let spongy moths and brown-tailed moths defoliate and kill our forests. So we are responsible to try and mediate the mess we made. Just one more note. Oh, go ahead.
Sam, can I ask a quick question that's related to the brown-tail?
Sure.
I was picking brown-tails off of shrub of mine recently, and I found two that were hanging limply from the branch, and one, it was some kind of a, I think one was a spider, and I think one, there was I think it's called a shield bug or something. Have you heard of that? Like other
Sure.
insects predating on brown tails? I was trying to think of how I could encourage that.
I would think that that fits into this idea that when we have a newly introduced species, so way back when the brown tail first came, there are similar caterpillars here in North America. And there are shield bugs with very long sort of snouts or straw-like mouth parts that can get through all of the spines on a native spiny caterpillar and suck that caterpillar dry. So those may have been able to feed on them right from the beginning. But those types of predators, birds, shield bugs, spiders, they definitely take a toll on caterpillar numbers, both native and non-native, but they're not highly specialized. They tend to eat a lot of different caterpillars, and they just don't have a very good balancing effect. We need a lot more caterpillars to fall prey to very highly specialized insects to see the balance start to show up. So when we have a native caterpillar like the woolly bear here, well, actually, let's go with these tussocks here. This Orgia tussock, another native species, that has certainly fallen prey to various birds, even though it's got all these itchy spines all over it. It's certainly been fed upon by the occasional stink bug or shield bug, but it has a whole host of native parasitoid wasps and flies that specialize on it. There's one wasp called a mummy maker that lays an egg into this caterpillar, and the larval wasp lives inside the caterpillar for a time. And then when it's ready to become an adult wasp, it spins a cocoon within the caterpillar's body, and it turns the caterpillar into a shelter, a mummy around it. And then the wasp emerges later from that old caterpillar husk. That's a one wasp to one small group of caterpillars situation. So when these tussocks get out of control, when we have too many white marked tussocks one year, there are these native insects that specialize on them and are so closely linked that, big population boom of these, we get a big population boom of the parasitoids, and the numbers come back down again. And that's the kind of specialist relationship that just didn't exist for the brown-tailed moths. And people tried to create it by releasing those specialist predators. Right now, there are all kinds of things. I'm going to sort of wrap up the brown-tailed moth discussion with this, but there are all kinds of things that have already been released to try and control them. The pathogens have been effective in the past. As far as I've heard, one likely explanation for the outbreak in recent years is just a pattern of weather that had some dry springs where the pathogen didn't thrive, and it allowed them to start to reproduce again in large numbers. If that's the case, these things that are already in place should kick in again, and hopefully we'll see a decrease in the numbers. This is not my area of expertise. Certainly, I'm not aware of the best control methods of all of this. But I do want to just highlight that difference between, native species eating a leaf, which can look bad for a plant, look bad for the ecological world, but really be a benefit, and a non-native species that sort of takes and doesn't give back. Okay. Let me just think if there's anything left that I wanted to say. Well, I'll just show you this because they are some of my favorites. This is that eastern tent caterpillar mass here again. So don't confuse these with the brown-tailed moths. They both make the webs. The eastern tent caterpillars have over 100 species of even just one group of parasitoid wasps, the ichneummonid wasps that use them. They have specialized relationships with cuckoos. They're a pretty neat, charismatic, and native caterpillar worth celebrating. So that's very different than the brown-tailed moth and the spongy moth. I know that I've been going on for a while, so I'm going to do like a rapid fire. Let's look at some other caterpillars, and then we're going to move on to another segment here. So just to be able to share what I've got in front of me, here is a caterpillar that's mimicking red cedar. When you have a caterpillar that's camouflaging against an evergreen, we tend to see dots and dashes and lines. We'd have pinstripes on a pine feeder, and we have these dots and dashes on a cedar or a red cedar or juniper feeder. That's the lemur's pinion. That one is also omnivorous. So if another caterpillar walks by, it just gives up eating those leaves and grabs the caterpillar. There are a lot of caterpillars that eat grasses. They're incredibly difficult to find, grasses and sedges. The caterpillars in here are sedge feeders. I only find these by going out at night with a UV or purple flashlight, and the caterpillars glow green, whereas all the sedge or grass glows purple. And I can't even find it under the microscope here. I know there's a caterpillar in here somewhere. Oh, okay, there we go. Here's the caterpillar on the sedge leaf. It's got little pink horns on one end that help us find it. And then you can go along the body all the way to the end where it has little tails. This is the eyed brown caterpillar. I know there's another one in here somewhere, but I may not be able to find it within the realm of the next hour. This was a very exciting find for me. It was the first time I've ever seen these this year. So despite having gone out with these purple flashlights a lot, to uncover them was exciting. We've also got just a whole host of twig mimics. We've seen one already. This is a much larger species called a xanthotype. These can be brown or green. Something we didn't talk about was a defensive sort of quality called phenotypic plasticity. It means what you look like is flexible based on what you experience. So as this caterpillar grows, if it was eating a woody plant with a lot of brown, it would have become a brown caterpillar. But if it was eating a lot of green leaves and was around a lot of green leaves, sort of surrounded by it, they become a green caterpillar. That's a classic sort of twig mimic right there. All right. I keep mentioning parasitoids, so I want to show you a few of those. And then with the remaining time, I would just love to introduce you to the idea of how caterpillars grow and change, the pupa and the adult. And that should hopefully give us some time for questions as long as we've got another. Are we going to as late as 7:30? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, cool. Then we've got time. All right, so there are a lot of wasps out there. Wasps are probably one of the most diverse groups of animal, and oops, I'm going to lose this one, of animal on the planet. And one of the reasons for that is there's a lot of wasps that are parasitoids. These are things that lay eggs in other insects and grow up inside of them and eventually burst out. And that process does kill the other insect, but it's food and a life strategy for a creature like this. So this wasp came out of this wasp cocoon here. This originated though in the body of a brown-hooded owlet caterpillar. So last year we had this incredible caterpillar with all these bright colors that we found on goldenrod. But right before the caterpillar was ready to move on and become a moth, a larva of a wasp ate the caterpillar from the inside, came out, and this spring we've got this wasp to look at. And it turns out that that wasp only uses the brown-hooded owlet. We're not 100% sure. We're sort of doing research on this right now, but there's a lot of similar species, and it seems that every owlet caterpillar, very closely related to each other, has its own version of that wasp. So that's a very powerful relationship. Some of these wasps do very strange things. So we have one in process here. This is a caterpillar called a catocala, or an underwing caterpillar. These are bark mimics. And this caterpillar has been zombified. It's a zombie caterpillar because it's been used by a zombie making wasp. So a little wasp, just sort of a little black wasp, very tiny, found this caterpillar and laid a single egg into its body. The egg hatched. The larva of the wasp lived inside the caterpillar as the caterpillar was walking around and eating, but eventually it was big enough to move on. And today that wasp larva has popped out of the caterpillar, and it's been in the process of spinning a cocoon out of silk, though I think it's sort of scared at the moment and has stopped. So that's the wasp larva here. And the caterpillar is still alive. The caterpillar has been partially eaten. The wasp came out of it. The caterpillar is still alive though. Before the wasp left the caterpillar, it gave the caterpillar a cold, a virus that changed the caterpillar's behavior. So the caterpillar hangs out with the wasp after it emerges. It sits on top of the cocoon the wasp will eventually spin, and it aggressively defends the wasp from predators. So this is a zombie caterpillar. It's not going to survive this, but while it's still alive, it protects the thing that ate it from the inside from potential predators. And there's a lot of things that are trying to eat the wasps after they come out of the caterpillar. One of the most common finds we have here at the lab, when we find a caterpillar that's already on top of a parasitoid, or a parasitoid's already come out of it in the wild, and we bring that caterpillar and its parasitoid wasp inside, more often than not, we get a hyperparasitoid from the wasp. I'm not explaining this very well. There are a lot of wasps that like to lay eggs and wasps that like to lay eggs in caterpillars. So these are just the standard connections we see in the natural world, things, using other things. And that's really what we want to see in the natural world. If there's something out there that's not being used, if there's a caterpillar out there that doesn't have a native wasp that likes to lay eggs in it, and if there's a wasp out there that doesn't have a wasp that likes to lay eggs in it, then we end up with situations like with the invasive brown tail moths and spongy moths, where there's just too many of something and not enough of some resource. So as shocking as some of these relationships are, and there's plenty of other shocking examples, these parasitic wasps and flies are definitely a benefit to the ecological world. And there's something that I've come to appreciate, even though I'm a big fan of caterpillars. I've come to appreciate them as very much part of the story. So this is a fall cankerworm. It's a native species that some years has big population booms and can eat a lot of leaves. But if it's having that population boom, well, there's a eulophid wasp. This is a cluster of ectoparasite or outside parasitic eulophid wasps will also thrive on those caterpillars that are thriving, and eventually the caterpillar numbers will come down again. We're quite interested in these. We're doing research at the lab, keeping specimens of any of the parasitoids that come up and getting them identified. We want to know which ones are native, which ones were introduced. We want to understand how specialized they are. Is the wasp really just using one species of caterpillar or many? And part of the reason is because there have been problems with parasitoids in the past. The spongy moth eating way too much and the brown tail moth eating way too much 100 years ago spurred people to release a parasitic fly called Compsoglyra that eats the spongy moth and the brown tail moth, but it also lays eggs in all of our native species. So that creature, that introduced parasitic fly, has been a real negative. And we've seen the decline of things like the Cecropia caterpillar I showed you earlier, and even the disappearance of certain caterpillars. So this one here was the largest caterpillar in New England, but it's now extinct, regionally extinct in New England. You have to go further south to see it now. It's called the hickory horned devil, or the regal moth. They get about the size of a hot dog. They turn bright green with red horns and diagonal stripes. Crazy looking creature. I would have loved to have been able to go out and find these in my backyard growing up. But in the 1980s, the last of them disappeared from this area. And one possible cause, one theory, is that it was that introduced parasitic fly really liked to use these in the summertime after they grew up inside spongy moth bodies earlier in the spring. And that was just too much for these species. So I think I'm giving you a sense that nature is complicated and that basically we want to see native creatures interacting in creative ways, lots of things using other things. But people come in and we change something, we add something, or we take it away, and the results are very confounding, hard to predict, and often negative for the overall ecological world. And there's a whole group of people out there who spend their lives trying to figure out how to mediate that, how to make those things better, and how to keep more creatures from other parts of the world to come from coming here and making messes. So that's something to definitely learn more about. A lot of conservation work being done. All right, should I do a rapid fire metamorphosis for you guys? Usually I have, an audience out there to give me a thumbs up or say, whoa, that's way too many caterpillars for one day. But since I don't, I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyways, I think. Sound good? Okay. So we have a lot of caterpillars at the lab, and most of them start here. I put out the mercury vapor lights and the UV lights, and we find moths. We find a female moth, she lays eggs, and we get to raise the caterpillars from those eggs. So every caterpillar starts as an egg. This is the egg of a Heterocampa leaf edge mimic caterpillar. You can really see the little baby caterpillars, the embryos have already developed. There's a little caterpillar face there. The body is curled up. And these will hatch, the red ones will hatch tomorrow morning. We've just done this enough that we know when all of these things are coming. One of them hatched today though. And, you know, look at this egg. It's just a little round orb. There's no little pockets or extra sort of spikes. But the caterpillar that came out is quite bizarre. It's got a lot of extra spikes. This is the result. So this is the hatchling Heterocampa leaf edge mimic caterpillar. And all of those horns, all of those spines were inflated like water balloons. Oops, sorry, hold on a second. Were inflated when the caterpillar hatched. It hatched out, it didn't have those. It took a deep breath, pressurized its body, and those things popped out again, sort of like a water balloon filling up with water, and then they hardened and it got these wonderful antlers. So a lot of metamorphosis actually works through hatching or shedding, and then changing your form through inflating parts and hardening. So to get these antlers, again, it didn't have them right when it hatched. It had to sort of create them and harden them. So this caterpillar's tiny. Oh, and one's making an escape right now. This caterpillar is so small that it doesn't have to worry about predation by birds. It could care less if it's seen by a bird because it's too small to be of any interest food-wise. It's just not going to make an impact for a bird to eat this. So right now it's investing in these antlers and physical defenses that it can use to whack away tiny little parasitic wasps that want to lay eggs into its body. So it's totally invested in that. But caterpillars don't stay exactly the same as they grow. They shed their skin. Sometimes we get to watch a shed actually happening on the screen, not today. But when they shed, they have an opportunity to change their form. So the same species we were just looking at, this is it after a few weeks. It shed its skin now at this point 3 times, and it looks nothing like its younger self. This is actually a very ornate leaf edge mimic. It'll eat a part of the leaf, and then it uses its own body to fill in the edge of the eaten leaf. And this is camouflaged against bird predation now. It's a bigger caterpillar, birds want to eat it. So they're hiding in plain sight. They're green, they're mottled, they look like an old leaf in summer. And they've done that because if they still had those big dark antlers and bright red colors, they'd be picked off real quick by a whole bunch of chickadees. So again, this is part of metamorphosis, their life cycle. They grow, they shed, they change form, they're able to inflate structures. Sometimes they shed things like the antlers away. They're constantly adapting. This is a great advantage, despite that shedding your skin is a hard thing to do. And if you get to watch it, you'd really understand that. They have to shed their skin, their heads, their legs, their breathing tubes. They have to shed all kinds of things just to get a little bit bigger. Despite all that work, it lets them adapt to their very specific moment in life. So for the caterpillars so far, it was adapting to being really tiny, susceptible or vulnerable to wasps. And then as they grow, to be able to become that leaf edge mimic through sheds that is a better defender against birds. Now, no caterpillar stays a caterpillar forever though, and eventually they're going to shed, and instead of having a new caterpillar form underneath, they're going to become a pupa. Pupa are very surprising things to a lot of people. This is the pupa of a tobacco hornworm, and it's moving right now. There's a huge misconception that a pupa is just a pod that has a caterpillar inside that's melting and reforming as an adult. That's rather a myth. This is something that the caterpillar doesn't make, it's something that the caterpillar becomes. So a tobacco hornworm, which is a green caterpillar with a little horn on its rear end, eventually is done feeding and it will start to change internally. It becomes the pupa within its old caterpillar skin, and then sheds the caterpillar skin away and reveals that this is its new body. So this isn't something inside of it wiggling, this is just it wiggling its rear end. and you can see its body parts. And the body parts don't look caterpillar-like at all. Sorry, I'm a little, there we go, it's better orientation. They don't look caterpillar-like at all. They actually look very much like the adult moth or butterfly. You've got a wing bud here. We've got an antenna coming down from behind the head, legs, an eye, and for this species, the hornworm, the tongue chamber. This is why the tobacco hornworm is a champion of New England. This is why it's a good creature here. It eats your tomatoes, it eats native plants in the tomato family, but as an adult, it's going to have a tongue about twice the length of the body, and it pollinates many of the same plants it eats as a caterpillar, actually, things like tobacco and datura. Now that's just one of many pupa. Here's a pupa that's got this wonderful dust all over it. It's the pupa of an underwing. So we saw the underwing that had been used by the zombie making wasp. Here's the pupa of a similar underwing. This one, for some reason, gets this blue cast to it, gets all this dust. This one pupates in leaf litter and develops very quickly. But right now, just a pupa through and through. If you open it up, there's no caterpillar. There's just pupa organs inside, although change is coming. The same is true about these. This is the pupa of a butterfly. You can still see the wing bud here. You can see legs coming down, antenna, and let's get the face over here. A little eye right here. So the pupa of a butterfly is a little different than some of the moth pupa you look at, only because it's camouflaged. Butterflies as a group pupate out in the open where birds can see them, so they have to be camouflaged. Their pupa are often very ornate or jewel-like, but you're still just looking at the animal right here. Now, all of this changes, and it's already changing with some of the creatures I've got in my box here. A pupa at first, again, is just a pupa. It's the entire animal right there. The skin is connected to the body. It's not a shell. But eventually, just like the caterpillar became the pupa will become the adult. And this one just a day ago was bright green. This is the juniper twig geometer pupa. This would be right in a tree. So this is not a pupa of a butterfly. It's a pupa of a moth that would also be exposed to where birds can see them. So it had to be camouflaged. It was all green, but now I'm starting to see more details of the wing. I can see features of the antenna in there, and the eyes are started to turn a little red. We're looking at the actual adult form growing now within the pupa body. So just like the caterpillar became the pupa under its caterpillar skin, the pupa is becoming the adult under its pupa skin. And it will shed away the pupa skin in another day or so, and the adult will emerge. Now, there's a lot of science behind this, a lot of stuff people have spent a long time trying to figure out how it works. But the basics are that these creatures, they're not, just building external structures and transforming within. They are changing their bodies again and again. They're caterpillars changing just through sheds as they grow to be bigger caterpillars with different defenses, different ornaments. Then they're becoming a pupa, which is totally uncaterpillar-like, and the pupa helps them transform effectively into an adult. And the adults, no more chewing mandibles, no more prolegs, no more eating leaves. The adults have completely separated themselves out in the ecological world from the caterpillars that they once were through this pupa stage. Because of time, I'm gonna just sort of probably call it right there. But questions could bring me all kinds of places. So I'm really excited to have 15 minutes to chat. And I hope that was the right amount of caterpillar for your Wednesday evening.
Sam, thank you so much. That was awesome. I know my kids are sitting here in awe of these incredible creatures. So one question I have, is there a likely place or habitat to find a Luna moth caterpillar? Someone would love to see one.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can give you like a superpower for Luna moths here. It's those UV flashlights. Luna moths are reasonably common in the countryside, so coast of Maine for sure. And the UV flashlights, one I could recommend is called the UV Beast, which you can get online. They shine this intense purple light, and everything in the world turns purple except for all the best caterpillars, the slug caterpillars, the Polyphemus giant silk moths, the Luna giant silk moths, all the big sphinx, they glow like light bulbs. So one way to find a Luna is to walk around with this purple light and focus on the Luna's host plants. And in the north, Lunas prefer birches, paper birch and gray birch are the two to focus on. As you go further south, Lunas often turn up on hickories. And as you go further south even more, you start looking on sweet gum and black gum. But I would say looking at birches with a UV light is a great way to start, or just look for a lot of caterpillar poop under birches. I would focus your search in June and early July, especially. By August, the Lunas are starting to wrap up on the trees.
Excellent. Someone said, loving your presentation from Australia. Would love to buy a microscope camera setup like you are using. Can you give any more info there on the brand or specific?
I can. Hold on a second. I always get this question. I think I just shared a screen. So let me, are you all seeing the info of the microscope here?
Yes.
Okay. So when we started doing this work about, well, 10 years ago, if we were to get a microscope like this, it would have cost us $10,000, something like that. Now HDMI digital microscopes are really quite broadly available, still very underused in education, nature centers, classrooms. There should be many more of these out there. The one we're using, the Hay Ear, definitely is the best balance of like really good crisp image, and it does video and time lapse and all of that. For the price, and they've come down a bit. I think you can get something like I'm using for $180 now. But there's also other HDMI microscopes that are less expensive. You just always want to look for one that says HDMI microscope and hooks directly up to a screen. Anytime you start having to use a computer, the computer crashes or the quality is reset. We really like these ones that just go directly to the screen. I gave one of these to, well, something like this to my sister who had 2 young kids, well, still has 2 young kids. And they used it a few times. It was fun, and it ended up back in a box. I brought down a $50 LCD screen and I set it up as a permanently on microscope station by their back door. And now it's used basically every single day. The kids come in from the backyard with who knows what that they found. It goes under the microscope. Unfortunately, in my sister's eyes, every dinner seems to go under the microscope. But the idea of a microscope station seems to work really well. And that's what we've set up here at the lab. We have microscope stations and at our programs. So people feel like, you know, there's always a quick way to go and investigate the smaller world. But they're remarkable. I really recommend them. And although there's always some nervousness about involving technology with environmental education or the outdoors, our experience is that when somebody gets to look at a leaf mining caterpillar blown up under a microscope, what they see when they go outside changes. They notice them more and it feels different. You know, a little brown mark on a leaf isn't just a brown mark anymore. It's that tiny caterpillar in that tiny world eating cells. And so I really, really love these scopes. And I'm not yet sponsored by any microscope company. Maybe that should change at some point.
Thank you. People are asking, how can they attract caterpillars and moths to their yard?
Well, it's sort of all about the plants. Lots of movement these days to plant native plants in your gardens and in your landscapes. Basically, a native natural plant to your area is always going to host and support more insects than a non-native plant, sometimes drastically slow. A lot of the plants we put in our gardens, to most insects, might as well be plastic. They're pretty, but they're not actually part of the natural world. They're not feeding things. They're not part of that everything is using everything else sequence. So you can plant things in your yard that support a broad number of species, like introducing an oak tree, a cherry tree, a birch, or a poplar. That's very, very important in areas that don't have those plants. So if you're in an urban area and there's no oak tree in your neighborhood, you plant an oak and you let some leaf litter, build up underneath it, and you could be supporting and bringing in hundreds of species of insects that couldn't have survived in your neighborhood otherwise. In the countryside, where you might have more oak and cherry and poplar and birch resources nearby, You can plant some less common plants. You could plant things that are usually habitat specialist plants, like things that live in bogs or swamps. Or you can plant just some targeting plants, something that only a couple of caterpillars eat, but they're really cool ones that you want to see. So for instance, around here, we've got lots of oak woodlands, but if I plant a spice bush, which we're right on the edge of the actual range of spice bush, I get spice bush swallowtails laying eggs on it and using it, which wouldn't otherwise be there. But if my mother was planting a new tree in her backyard in Newton, I would absolutely talk to her about looking at paper or gray birches, trembling aspen, poplars, oaks, red oak, black oak, or white oak, and just bringing in those like stalwart big plants. And then there's also all the little things like, all the meadow plants, milkweeds, goldenrods. There's a lot of focus on planting milkweed. I would just suggest to think that monarchs that eat the milkweed are one creature of many that we want to have in our ecosystems. So a meadow that has milkweed, native grasses, goldenrods and asters, and even some plants we think of as just general weeds can really support a lot more. And the reason why you would want them, I want them because I love these creatures. I'm thrilled to see a caterpillar eating a plant I put in the ground. You may want them for that reason, or maybe it's because you know that with a lot of caterpillars on a plant, you're feeding a lot of baby birds. Things like chickadees need, 3,000 caterpillars to raise a clutch of eggs. So you're doing a lot of good for the entire ecosystem by welcoming caterpillars into your yard. I think the people who get the most from this turn it into a bit of a game. They have a yard list of creatures and they go out and they're like, oh, I want something new in my yard this year. So you put in a sweet pepper bush, and then you get a sweet pepper bush Nola moth that you never had in the neighborhood before, but it shows up after that.
Excellent. Someone said I had 30 black swallowtail first to fourth instar cats in my garden on fennel, parsley, and dill. A few days later, only one was left. Where would they go?
Well, there's a lot of potential answers. One answer is a lot of people will call us worried about their caterpillars in their yards, like the black swallowtails, because when they get really big and you're noticing them most, so you've got big juicy caterpillars in the yard, they do start to disappear overnight, sometimes in masses, because they wander before they become a pupa. So black swallowtail spends some time searching out a nice place to put down some thread and sort of string itself up against a branch or a growing shoot to shed its skin and become a pupa. So they do disappear at that stage. So if they were very large, they just went off to become a pupa. If they weren't very large, well, there's definitely birds, spiders, stink bugs, and many parasitoids that use them. And it's very unusual for a high percentage of any caterpillar batch in the wild to survive. Moths and butterflies lay a ton of eggs so that they can have, enough of those eggs survive and get through all of those, challenges we talked about. But yeah, black swallowtails, I've heard that before, and usually it's because they wandered to find a place to pupate.
All right. Someone had asked about, is there a mercury vapor light that you recommend? And along those lines, what type of light attracts Cecropia moths?
So one of the companies that used to sell like all the specialized collecting equipment was BioQuip, and they just went out of business, unfortunately, or they just closed. So we're sort of in an in-between spot right now with what I can recommend. I've been experimenting with UV LED panels that you can get like on Amazon. They range from like $50 to $100, and they've been bringing in a lot of moths, including things like Luna's, Cecropia, all of that. But nothing quite beats the 150 watt plus ballasted mercury vapor. They're just so hard to get these days. You can try looking for a real mercury vapor at a hardware store. But yeah, it's a challenge right now, so I'm not sure what to say. I think if you wanted to start moth lighting right now, I would either go and look for mercury vapor or metal halide that's broad spectrum, classic parking lot light, really high wattage, or I would get a ultraviolet LED panel with as pure a UV light as possible. And both of those have been successful. So I'm going to do a lot of experimenting this year now that the old mercury vapors are not available, and try and figure that out for you guys.
Excellent. We look forward to hearing that. So let's see, on kind of the flip side, for kids, what tools would you recommend, magnifiers, things for children to explore caterpillars they find in their yard?
Well, certainly if you can look into a microscope, these are used by kids here in the lab all the time, and there are ones that go outside, but a magnifying glass for outdoor exploration is great. I think what I would suggest based on my experience growing up is maybe a little experimenting with having special guests come into your home sometimes. I know that's a challenge, but getting a personal relationship with these creatures, learning to love them, was a big part of my development as a naturalist. And that happened because I was getting to raise them and hold them and see them and feel them and really experience them on a personal level. Now, there's a lot of things that can go wrong with that. There's a lot of reasons to be careful with that. So one of the tools, it's just sort of a method. It's to not think about everything that is found as a project that has to have a beginning and an end. Every caterpillar has to be raised to be a moth or a butterfly. Have some special guests. So if children have a couple of little containers where they can get something that's curious to them on a leaf outside, and can bring it in to observe it in a tank for 2 or 3 days, it can be released after that. But then there's the experience of calmly getting to see it eat and poop and change and maybe erupt in parasitoid wasps. You know, these are things that stay with you. And when I took the time to experience that indoors, I mean, both built that personal relationship with these creatures, but it also changed how I interacted with the outdoors. You know, I started taking more time to see these things actually happening outside too. So it's a weird recommendation. Definitely not saying bring in baby owls and salamanders all the time, but an occasional getting to bring in a caterpillar to see, you know, what it does on a leaf is rewarding. Sorry that my light just turned off, but we'll make it through.
No worries. I think we are towards the end here. I have one last question, and this is coming from, it says, greetings from India. So
Wow.
we have some viewers from across the globe. Can native moth caterpillars adapt to eating ornamental or invasive plants?
Yes, but with a lot of caveats. So I've found the slug caterpillar eating buckthorn, which is a non-native plant here. I have found often Cecropia caterpillars eating buckthorn as well. We've got a lot of ash feeding caterpillars that feed on native ashes, will feed on lilac and privet. We don't always know, though, whether that's a good thing. In studying the sphinx, native ash feeding sphinx caterpillars that feed native ash feeding sphinx caterpillars, we reared them on privet and lilac, and they didn't do as well on those. And in fact, the ones on privet all came out deformed in the end. We've got a paper coming out on that. So it's really, again, it's very hard to judge. Even when native caterpillars start using non-native plants, maybe that's just a good thing. Maybe we've just can celebrate that the unicorn caterpillar likes to eat buckthorn, but without looking in a little deeper, we can't tell whether that's a good thing or actually just something to add to the list of negatives. So as much as you can, try and plant native plants and discourage non-natives. One way to interact with that is to not plant anything, but just get rid of the invasive species that show up and let nature sort of take over a corner of the yard. But yeah, it's weird, like unicorn caterpillars, which I didn't get to show you today, they really love buckthorn. Like I might target that non-native plant to get that native caterpillar.
Wow, Sam, thank you so much. This has been an incredible presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us. I know we're at 7:30 here, so any questions that we didn't get to, we will make sure to get those over to Sam, and hopefully we can get those answered. But I think we had everything pretty much answered here. So thank you so much, Sam, for your time. I know we're really eager to get over to the lab at some point. Sounds
well, and I
fantastic.
hope I can make it up there to do a program sometime. I know the lab is coming to do a residency at the Coast of Maine Botanic Gardens, and we do get around New England. So keep an eye out for us. And every week is different. Caterpillars come and go, and we get to see a lot of neat things here. And I'd love to share those with you if we get a chance. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. We hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.